No, here we go. So these are our essential questions again. What is civic power? How do we access it? Let's keep these questions in mind. In this case, you're going to see a really remarkable artifact of civic power, how people came together. Wealthy people came together, wealthy, intelligent people came together. How does change occur in a federal republic? Keeping in mind that this is also a question. And this is really important because the activities that we're going to look at are actually the establishment of the federal republic, what the contours of that look like. To some extent, you read about the Constitution for today, so you understand to some extent what that structure looks like. Let's focus in on the compromises. So our presentation this time is going to be, what did colonies and individuals want from the Constitutional Convention, and what compromises did they make in developing the Constitution? Again, and Allison noted this already, but it's just so important. You know, it's one thing to have a strong belief. It's another to be able to realize your beliefs in action with other people, and some of whom actually might not think just like you, right? So compromise is just so essential for positive change, and certainly positive change in a federal republic. Okay, so here are some terms: bicameral, partisan, framers, great compromise, enslaved versus slaves, three-fifths compromise, and anti-federalists versus federalists. Some of these words I've talked about already. And I'll rehearse them. Some words might even actually look familiar, but I might say some nuanced ideas with respect to it, and then some might just be completely new. Let's start with who is actually present at the Constitutional Convention. Remembering we're in 1787 right here. Ultimately, the Constitution will be ratified. That is put into practice in 1789, so it didn't happen immediately. But in 1787 is when we have that, what's called the Constitutional Congress, the second one actually, but the Constitutional Convention, the one that most people refer to. Oops. Oh, is my mic cutting out?
A little bit.
Sorry about that. I will try to speak up a little bit louder. I'm not actually using my mic today because I was having trouble with it earlier. All right, I'll go louder. I can do that. These are the people present. Here are some numbers though. Let's look at some numbers. 100 days was this convention in the, again, hot Philadelphia summer of 1787. Made even hotter by the fact that the windows were all boarded up in order to maintain a level of privacy. So it was just so miserable in this space, which actually might have actually played in the fact that they were able to accomplish compromises. You wonder if you put a bunch of lawmakers into a small room in Philadelphia on a very hot summer, maybe we'd have more things done. Okay, so 100 days. 74 delegates were invited. And we have the different delegates on this side. You recognize, no doubt, many of these names. There's Governor Morris. Again, I mentioned he's probably the most prolific speaker. He's a representative from Pennsylvania. Ben Franklin, another representative from Pennsylvania. He's the oldest guy here. He's 81 at this time. He'll live till he's 84. You recognize, no doubt, George Washington, George Mason, the namesake. Another namesake, James Madison. The street that our school is on, Madison, is named after James Madison, as well as James Street. So some local connections there. Alexander Hamilton, right? You recognize a lot of these names. So 74 delegates were invited. These 55 attended from every colony except for Rhode Island. 39 would ultimately ratify it in 1789. So yeah, the numbers are getting down. From 74 invited to 55 attended to 39 who signed it. And the most important number for us today is 4 compromises. Let's look at these 4 compromises. In short, I'll just lay out the 4 and then we'll sort of unpack it. And I'll begin with this one in the upper left quadrant. Representation. How should the new United States determine representation in the lawmaking branch of the government? Essentially, the problem is, does a big state with 400,000 people get the same representation as a little state with 50,000 people? So some different positions in a compromise that arise from this. Counting enslaved inhabitants. A quick note about language. In general, in history courses, the nomenclature, the preferred terms one uses with respect to slaves is actually enslaved, enslaved women, enslaved Africans, enslaved African Americans, enslaved children, enslaved indigenous peoples. And that is not to not recognize that they are indeed slaves, yes, but you put the humanity before the commodity, if that makes sense. So words really do matter. And in general, and sometimes I slip and I say slaves, and I don't think it's not a big deal, I don't think at all, but the idea is sort of develop some muscle memory around nomenclature and the words that we use, which really do matter.
That's a good, I'm glad you said that, Adam, because we practiced that when we were reading Just Mercy, and we talked about calling people incarcerated people rather than criminals.
Yeah. Thank you for chiming in and let me know that there's some alignment in that. Because yes, enslaved individuals, but they're also enslaved mothers, they're enslaved siblings, they're enslaved musicians, they're enslaved Christians. As we say, slaves, it really reduces them to a commodity without allowing other human features. So we'll talk about enslaved individuals. Going into this second compromise, it is, how should enslaved people be counted in the census to determine taxation and representation? Let's remember one of the real big problems of the Articles of Confederation, that initial attempt at a constitution, was that it couldn't raise taxes. And taxes are important because, above all, you needed some sort of professional military. And as we recall from the first presentation, military arrived, the big reason for the military was to put down domestic conflicts, not foreign ones. Trade of enslaved individuals. What, if anything, should be done about the brutal and economically valuable trade in kidnapped African people? That's the slave trade. It is not, the dialogue is not about ending the institution of slavery. It's about the international trafficking of kidnapped Africans. And then finally, distribution of power. Who gets the power? Should more go to the state, the localized levels, or should there be a stronger central government? Okay, so let's break it down. How should the United States determine representation? Virginia, and we'll look at some numbers in a moment here. Virginia has a lot of people. I believe we work from the 1790 census is the closest one. And we sort of subtract a few years to try to arrive at the closest number of population figures. And so over 400,000 people in Virginia, white people in Virginia counted. So as a very large state, and proposed a plan that representation for government should be informed by population numbers. So you get more people in positions of authority. That's sort of that quantitative power piece that Eric Liu talks about. These more people would equate to more political power that you can send to represent your country for what's going to be this Congress. So based on population. Smaller states like New Jersey proposed the New Jersey Plan, which said, while you have more people, we're still states and we are equal members of this union. So it shouldn't matter how many people you have. It's all about membership. And Virginia is no greater a member of this union than smaller states like New Jersey. Okay, here is the compromise. Oh, here's actually some numbers first. I gave you these numbers. So you can see Virginia, 420,000, very large state, wanting that. And you can see, like, even, Massachusetts, a northern state, probably disagrees in a lot of respects with Virginia on a number of issues, but probably really liking this Virginia plan, which allows them to send more delegates because they have more population, right? So New Jersey here, smaller. Rhode Island, certainly liking New Jersey's plan. So, this quantitative data is just endless, what you can kind of think and consider with respect to how people thought. Okay, here is the compromise offered by Connecticut Representative Roger Sherman, also called the Great Compromise. So essentially you have two chambers. It's called bicameral. I think your Spanish is helping you out right here. It essentially means two chambers. Like bicycle, and I think cameral, what is it in Spanish? Like camera or something like that. You can see the language there. So two chambers, you have a lower and an upper. The lower chamber, or the lower house, it's called the House of Representatives, and that's essentially what Virginia wanted. Based on your population, you get to send more representatives to this lower house. There are 435 members. Washington has more members than Idaho, but not as many as California, right? That's what Virginia wanted. They also got what New Jersey wanted, and that becomes the upper house, the Senate, and two from each state. So you have 100 senators. I think that speaks for itself. You can see that there are different term limits as well. But the upper house, you actually have a longer term limit than in the lower house, the House of Representatives. Only 2 years, 6 years for senators. The president will be right in between them, right? 4 years. All right, that's our first compromise. How should enslaved people be counted in the census to determine both taxation and representation? So let's go back and let's just take a look here. This category, it's in quotation marks because it is the category that is labeled on the census from 1790. And again, this is adapted from that. So it's adopting the same language. This is essentially the numbers of registered. So the numbers would only go up, right? Enslaved individuals in the states. So Virginia here is looking at 420,000 people, but also 280,000 enslaved individuals. So for representation, that would put them nearly at 700,000 people. That would be a lot of representatives, right? And at the same time, if you're having to pay tax on these individuals, that's not a good thing either, right? So again, looking at what states like Virginia would want, mostly southern states, going back, they wanted enslaved people to be counted for representation, but they don't want to pay taxes on it, okay? No taxes on these individuals. Mostly northern white landowners wanted enslaved people to be counted for taxation, but not representation. These are completely opposite ends, right? Well, what happens? And I think you're probably familiar with this term. If not, you've probably heard it and been repulsed by it, is what we get the 3/5 compromise. I'm gonna read actually a segment from the Constitution, and based on this segment, you'll understand why we didn't assign it for you to read in its entirety. So the compromise: representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union according to their representative or their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So what is this saying? This is saying essentially that enslaved individuals will count as 3/5 of an individual toward both representation. So Virginia is looking at more than 420,000 people toward representation, but they're also paying tax on 3/5 of those enslaved peoples as well. So this is what you get the 3/5 compromise. Okay, it's a horrific title that people are essentially valued at 3/5 of a person. The third one, what, if anything, should be done about the brutal and economically valuable trade in kidnapped African people? And, you know, I just put this up just real quick to show us a timeline of where we're at. This white piece is breaking down the Stamp Act to the Bill of Rights. The first white settlement, and this isn't the first white person, but the emergence of settler colonialism, which is really the most brutal form, which seeks to replace populations. We get in 1526. If we take the beginnings of settler colonialism today, it comes out to 495 years. The midpoint of this timeline is 1775. I just find this interesting to look at because when we talk about the emergence of the nation in 1776, you know, as much time has passed since then, what's happening before that time, right? So what you get are really deeply entrenched problems, and in particular with the institution of slavery, which we see starting in 1619, the first ships arriving for sale. Slavery did exist prior to this time as well. There were different forms of it, particularly with indigenous populations. But the first ship that arrived to the commodification of people really is this happening in 1619. So this is
what you're saying there, Adam, is that there's been a lot of years during which for people to develop really strong opinions that would make compromise really challenging.
Yeah, and the entanglement of these problems just being deeply entrenched in culture and economy. Women are voting down here. And I just think it's interesting to look at the timeline too. Here's the emergence of white settlement. You get women voting way down here. You know, just even eyeball tests on this raise so many questions. But anyway, let's move. So what can be done? What did people want? Mostly Southern white land owners and enslavers wanted slave trade to continue. Mostly Northern white landowners, at least in rhetoric, said that the trade was repugnant. And it's interesting because, and yes, it is repugnant. And at the same time, that level of disdain didn't necessarily exist for the institution of slavery. It did with some peoples and many in the North. And at the same time, that same level of repugnance toward the institution of slavery didn't really exist for the same as it did with the traffic of slaves, which was generally considered pretty brutal. And yes, it was brutal. So what's the resolution here? Ultimately, they decide to retain the trafficking of enslaved Africans for another 20 years. This didn't mean much, you know? I mean, I guess it is good that international trade of slaves is going to stop after 20 years. It's still a remarkably long amount of time. I guess it is good to know that it will stop. And at the same time, at this point, slavery is a self-sustaining system. The deaths are frequent and brutal and horrific. And at the same time, the births are now exceeding deaths. So this is a self-sustaining system. Economically, it didn't rely on more people coming through the ports, okay? So this did really nothing as far as move the needle to eradicate slavery, because again, it was a self-sustaining system. last compromise is this one that addresses big government or little government. What do you do? And again, thinking about the term of federalism, that there are different levels and tiers of government. The Federalists wanted the bulk of the power, even all the power, to exist at the central level. And again, as one example, and I think that demonstrates this point, is the installation of a president for life, kind of like a king would be, or a queen, as opposed to set terms, would be one of the things that Federalists promoted. They wanted a really concise constitution, which lends toward vague language, which ultimately the vague language helps the people in power, because people in power will interpret that language how they believe, right? So the Constitution should be concise. Bill of Rights was not a document that should exist, and people should be trusting the protection of the government. Anti-Federalists, and by the way, again, examples here where you have Hamilton. You might know the Federalist Papers, maybe heard that, maybe even read that. Written by James Madison largely. Okay. Anti-Federalists. Remember those Sons of Liberty that dumped the tea? This is sort of, these individuals are really carrying the banner for the Anti-Federalists, these sort of proletariat groups that trust no power authorities, like Patrick Henry, once again, talked about him, Sam Adams. They believed the Constitution couldn't be too vague because the powers that be would interpret that to their ends and the protections of the people would be in peril, okay? Government should be limited at the central level, and colonies and individual colonies should be empowered politically to be able to determine things on their own in conjunction with a central government, not at the expense of a central government, right? So what is the compromise here? Oops. I forgot to have my image. All right, the compromise here is a Bill of Rights, and this Bill of Rights are the protections. Remember, I kind of went through those corny images. We had the breakup text, declaration, Dua Lipa, new rules, Constitution. But again, we don't want to be hurt again with these new rules, and therefore you have, the "you don't own me" by Grace and G-Eazy, this idea that I still retain rights that are inalienable to the individual, despite even that change in government, all right? The right to possess a firearm, right? Being the Second Amendment. Free speech, the first one. Your rights for search and seizure, you have those rights, and they're identified in the Bill of Rights. All right, so that is the final one. I did my best to be as sort of succinct as possible. So I think I can stop sharing at this point.